Bonjour! Bonjour! Bonjour, Marnie!
Bonjour, Jean-Charles.
We are so excited, dear friends, about dry January. But as a Frenchman, I've never heard this expression. So, Marnie, what does dry January really mean?
Well, I do think that dry January is unique to the United States, and I acknowledge that many people have a different interpretation of what it means. However, at Boisset, since we are specialists in fine dry wines, we have decided to interpret dry January as the time to drink our very driest wines. And as you know, as a Frenchman, all of our driest wines are French and for a very specific reason. So we're going to talk about that today and showcase some of our drier styles.
Well, I love this idea because how could we ever stop enjoying wonderful wine and great food? It's not because we celebrate at the end of the year that January should stop. In moderation, of course, but still have it as a complement to the greatest food of the world. So, voila.
Absolutely. And for many people, dryness is a word that is misunderstood. There are many people who think dry means quality, or that dry refers to a wine's acidity, or that it refers to some other trait. And it's often misused, in part, I think, because it's not actually properly being used in the wine world. Let's be honest. This wine might taste dry. We have our JCB number 5 is our first featured wine today, our fabulous rosé that is quite dry from the south of France, from the region called Provence. But let's be honest, no matter how dry this wine tastes, it sure looks wet to me. And that misunderstanding about the meaning of the word dry, I think, is at the root, the heart of the misunderstandings that we have with the American wine drinking public about the meaning of the word dry. And if you're ready, Jean-Charles, I'd be happy to do a little dive into that word, because I do a lot of training on this. I've been talking about this for probably 2.5 decades now, and it's one of my favorite topics to help explain that word and its meaning, its relevance, especially to our French wine portfolio.
So, Marnie, Vin enlighten us and let's go on the journey of education about dry wine. Yes. Very interesting topic. And dear friends, a very big trend.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen while we talk about fun facts on dry wines for dry January. And this is just so much fun. We really just have a good time with this stuff at Boisset. And as you know, I just mentioned, in plain English, the word dry means not wet, but that's clearly not what it means when we're talking about liquids like wine. In wine, dry is a descriptive term instead, and is widely misunderstood. As I mentioned, there are many folks who are not quite clear on what the word dry means. But dryness in wine is simply something that does not taste sweet. It's the opposite of sweet. So there are sweet wines and there are dry wines, and there are wines that fall somewhere in between those two ends of the scale. Now at Boisset, almost all of our wines are dry, but our very driest wines are always French. And sugar plays a key role in people's individual wine preferences. We do need to acknowledge that sweetness is a love or a hate thing. Some people absolutely love sweetness in wine. Others can't stand it at all. But dryness preference in wine, as we have, you, Jean-Charles, and I, we love our dry wines, but this is something that is often genetic. Sensitivity to sugar itself varies widely from one individual to the next. And
I love all those babies, by the way, Marnie.
I promise I won't try to hook them on wine until they turn 21, Jean-Charles. But dryness preference can also be driven simply by our cultural background, or even just our preferences in food. And that happens because dry wines simply do taste a little strange when they're served next to foods that contain a lot of sugar. And so cultures that cook with more sugar, like we see in soul food and comfort food in the United States, in Asian cuisines, for example, often in Scandinavia, those regions that cook with more sugar tend to favor sweeter wines to serve with those foods, because it just makes perfect sense. They taste better together. However, a dryness preference, what we are talking about in dry January, will often develop with experience. The more wines you taste, the more likely you are to acquire a taste for drier styles. But beginners tend to start off preferring sweeter wines at first, those that taste a little bit more like fresh fruit or fruit juice. And that's understandable. Sweetness versus dryness is one of the main flavor variables in wine and one of only two that can be detected only with the tongue. You need to let a wine touch your tongue to know whether it's sweet or dry, because it's not something you can smell. A wine can smell of sweet dessert-like things, like this JCB #5 has a vivid scent of wild strawberries, which we think of as a sweet thing. But when you taste the wine, on contact with the tip of the tongue, it is not sweet at all. It still tastes like strawberries, but not sweetness. Now, in many wines, perceived sweetness correlates with sugar content. So we talk about wines on a spectrum that goes from dry to off dry to sweet. And you can think of this as being like the levels of sweetness that you would find if you poured black coffee. If you drink it with no sugar at all, that would be the equivalent of a dry wine. If you put in a couple spoonfuls of sugar, that would be more like an off dry wine. And if you went whole hog and put in a full 5 cubes of sugar, that would be more what we call a sweet wine in the wine world. And we usually measure this in grams per liter or as a percentage of what we call residual sugar, meaning leftover sugar from the grapes when they were on the vine. But most people have kind of a threshold where they can no longer detect sweetness when it gets below 1%. So when we talk about this spectrum of dryness to sweetness, if wines fall below 1%, for example, French white Burgundy would typically average around 0.5%. Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon also below 1%, but higher at closer to 0.75%. These would be considered a dry wine because when you put them in your mouth, they don't register as sweet on the tip of the tongue. However, as soon as we get over 1%, for example, with German Rieslings, when we start getting into sweet dessert wines like port or Muscat de Baume de Venise, something along those lines, when you start getting higher percentages of sugar, those register right on the tip of the tongue instantly when you put them in your mouth as having the presence of sweetness. So if you notice sweetness on first sip, the wine is not dry by definition. Now, let's be honest, almost all cheap wines are at least a little sweet, and that's done because a tiny little bit of sugar can make a low quality wine taste palatable. And that's one of the reasons that people associate sugar content with low quality in wine, even though that's a little bit unfair. Most fine wines are dry though, like the vast majority of those that we produce and offer through our our my.boissetcollection.com website. And dryness isn't actually the quality factor, but it's true that only high quality wines can taste great when they're dry. And that's why it's true that there are some high quality wines that are sweet, but only high quality wines are really going to taste palatable, delicious, make you want to keep drinking till you get to the bottom of the glass, as compared to those other wines we were talking about a moment ago. So let's zoom into why is it that French wines taste drier than California wines? Because they kind of do. The more side-by-side tastings you do at Jean-Charles' house, for example, if you're a member of our collector experience program, that gives you a chance to taste side by side some of our wines from France versus our wines from California. And you'll notice that the California wines, even when they're dry, are not quite as dry as the French. So let's unpack that for a minute. First off, grapes simply just get sweeter when they get more sunshine and warmth. And because it's warmer and sunnier in the growing regions of California, we tend to have more of that natural grape sweetness present in the grapes before the winemaking process begins. So at harvest, generally speaking, the grapes we harvest in California for winemaking are just a little bit sweeter than those that we harvest in France for winemaking. But there's another factor too, and that is that as sugar goes up during the ripening process, there's another component in grapes that goes down, and that is acidity. And interestingly enough, on your palate, sweetness and acidity balance and neutralize each other out. So not only do French wines have a little less sugar, but they also taste drier because they have more acidity. They consistently have more acidity because they are grown in cooler climates and harvested at an earlier stage of ripeness, often by the equivalent of, 4, 5, even 10 days worth of ripeness compared to California. And it's true that high levels of acidity in wine neutralize sweetness on the palate. You can do this, you can test it. Just put a spoonful of sugar into a glass of water or tea or coffee, and then add lemon or something else that's acidic. And you'll notice that adding acidity makes the beverage taste less tart every time. And it's because sweetness and acidity are perceived by the same taste bud on the tongue, and they can't do both at the same time. So this helps us explain why sparkling wines in particular often contain more sugar than we can taste on first sip. It's because they're also much higher in acidity than standard wines, and that makes them taste drier than they really are. So let's think about this. If in France they have both lower sugar and higher level of acidity, which neutralizes sweetness, that explains why these wines almost always taste drier. Simply being grown in a cooler climate does half of the work in this case, but it's not the only factor either, because historical and cultural factors favor dryness in Europe as well. And of course, France, being the leader in fine wine production and evolution over time, is a leader in this category. Generally speaking, compared to the wines of Spain or Italy or Germany, French wines are the driest of all. And that's because sugar is the raw material that's necessary to create an alcoholic drink. So it's kind of like the gas tank for winemakers. Living yeast cultures are going to consume the sugar from the grapes and convert it into alcohol. So if you're looking for a higher alcohol content in the resulting beverage, which helps for stability, long-term aging is only made possible because the alcohol prevents spoilage and oxidation in the wine, you want to take all of that sugar and go all the way to dryness during the fermentation process. Because if you stop early, if you don't allow yeasts to convert all of the grape sugar into alcohol, what happens is you get a wine that's somewhere in between. It's got lower alcohol, it's got higher sugar, sort of like the French kiss wines that we offer in the JCB line. And those are delicious, but they do require very careful winemaking to prevent them from spoiling, because in many ways they're closer to grape juice than they are to dry wine in the bottle. And this process, if you allow fermentation to run its course, will get you very close to a fully dry wine. It never will get you quite to exactly zero, because not every shred of sugar in grapes is 100% fermentable, but it will get you close. The very driest wines are usually still going to contain at least 0.2, 0.3% sugar in their final chemical analysis. And of course, the most important factor, I think, and you would probably agree having grown up in France, is that drier wines are simply more flattering food partners when we start putting them alongside the flavors of continental and Mediterranean cuisine. Because the food in France very rarely contains sugar, is more often driven by salt, more savory flavors, then having a dry wine makes your food taste better. And we all know that in France, the wine and the food somehow are delicious on their own, but manage to taste even better together. And that works best with the very driest styles. And of course, if anybody who's watching wants to learn more on the interesting and fascinating French wine history that we're talking about, or our wine and food synergies, they should check out our book that you and I wrote together, Jean-Charles, called Passion for Wine. And we also have an amazing demonstration of how this works through our my.boissetcollection.com website. Go under experiences, private wine tastings, and select our Sommelier's Secrets experience, because it gives you a vivid demonstration of how salt and sugar interact differently with dry wines rather than when they're more fruity from California. And it's absolutely fascinating. I'm sure people watching it would love it.
Well, congratulations, Marnie. I'm learning such a great deal throughout those sessions. And I love your very focused graphics, because this is really essential as we all enjoy wine, to understand its segmentation, its sugar level, its dryness, its level of acidity. I mean, all this allows us to be amazing food matchers as well. Not only with savory, but as well, sugar. I mean, I've had extensive amount of chocolate and obviously desserts back in France in the last 3 weeks, and enjoyed it so much with beautiful Pinots, as well as great Cabernets and Champagne and sparkling wine. So I think we can as well, if we understand this beautiful matrix that you presented, really pair magnificently wine. And when you prepare it in your home and invite your friends, you want harmony. You want this amazing magical marriage of both to be equal to 3, right?
Absolutely. We often talk about wine and food pairing as if it only involves the wine and the food, but there is a third factor to consider because, of course, the person who's sitting in front of the wine and the food is the third point of the triangle and makes as much of a difference to what is perceived as a positive success and what is perceived as a negative clash than the wine or the food do. Now,
So,
I think we should talk about the red wine in the glass.
absolutely. Please do, Marnie, because that's your selection, which I think is a stellar wine. Naturally, it's a Burgundy Pinot from our estate, Domaine de la Vougerie in Burgundy. So it's all organic and biodynamically made. But tell us about the flavor profile and why it makes sense to have it in January.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I chose this wine because it's the epitome of dryness in the sense that Burgundy, the most historic wine producing region in France, was the first to really refine winemaking beyond, a basic staple to have at the table for nutrition purposes. It became exalted by the monasteries of Burgundy as a way to express their reverence for their religion, of course. And one of the things that they did was specialize in very dry styles of wine, like this Pinot Noir being, of course, native to the Burgundy region of France. And for many Americans who love Pinot Noir, but have only ever encountered California versions, swirling and sniffing this wine might come as a bit of a surprise because on the first scent, it doesn't smell as much like sweet desserts as California Pinot Noirs do. What happens in warmer, sunnier climates like California is that the grapes, as I mentioned, get riper, so they smell more like berries and cherries and chocolate and vanilla. Whereas what are you smelling on this one? Well, of course, there's a little bit of fruit here, but it smells almost more like those sour berries that you might use in a savory dish, like red currants or white currants or sour cherries, even, where the sweetness of the fruit is not a dominant characteristic, but the acidity is. And when you give it a swirl, you've got that, it's like cranberry and pomegranate, but there's also a kind of savory quality here. You've got an earthiness, an herbal quality, a minerality that makes this seem woodsy and outdoorsy. There's definitely a quality here that seems to align almost more with vegetables and entrees and appetizers rather than necessarily sugary things and dessert. And that is what we talk about as the classic French dryness. When you let it touch your tongue, we can confirm what the nose conveys and hints at when you taste it. Not even a hint of sugar recognition on the tip of the tongue, but oceans of brisk, refreshing acidity that just make your mouth water in a cascade on contact. And what is that doing? It's making you salivate. It's making you hungrier. It's making you thirstier. And this really is the point of dryness in French wines. It's designed to make your next bite of food taste its best by elevating your anticipation, making you salivate, and providing a beautiful counterpoint for the natural salt content in the dish.
So well articulated, Marnie. Thank you immensely. When you think of Provence, all the way back to the Romans, when we think about this Pinot Noir we're enjoying, the monks trace back the word Pinot Noir as early as 1375 in the heart of Burgundy, in my hometown of Vougeot. So we're talking 14th century. The monks did not have lavish food. And at the same time, this is why this wine was an amazing complement to it. So if you have a dry January, enjoy dry wine. You could have healthy food. Very important to have healthy living. We'll talk soon about healthy cuisine, healthy wines, but those wines are phenomenal for the reason we just explained. So, dear friends, join us for dry January. Thank you, Marnie.
So excited. We still have weeks of dry January left to enjoy.